dragons, gods, and spirits in Chinese mythology. Over the course of millennia, a rich and diverse literature of fairy tales and legends has been created in China. Here you will find everything. Ancient creation myths from the dawn of Chinese civilization, tales of remarkable people and animals, blood-curdling ghost stories, and pious tales of holy men and women. In this video, I have gathered a bunch of shorter stories that showcase this entire shimmering diversity. Some may be old, dear acquaintances, but others are meeting a broader audience for the first time here. The sources are approved by Chinese scholars, and the aim is to allow the public to become acquainted with this fascinating treasure of stories. The Chinese world. Landscape and climate. The Chinese Empire is approximately as large as Europe, and at least as varied in its nature and climate. In the north, the barren plains of the Yellow River stretch out with cold, dry winters and hot, humid summers. About a 2-day train journey to the south, the climate is tropical. High mountains are found in the western part of the country, reaching up toward the Tibetan Plateau. But in most of China, the mountains are low, except in the southeast, where highlands shield the southern coastal provinces like Fujian and Canton from the rest of the country. China's 2 great rivers rise in the western highlands, flow eastward, and water China's vast plains before eventually emptying into the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. The cradle of civilization. The oldest Chinese culture was founded in the northern part of present-day China, primarily in the area around the Yellow River, and extended north to the plains and south, all the way to the Yangtze River. This was the land from which the oldest mythology stems, the homeland of the first people created by the gods. Historical continuity. China's long history is as ancient as that of the Greeks and shares many similarities with Greek development. It began around 1100 BC, and by 300 BC, the Chinese, like the Greeks, already possessed a highly advanced civilization. But unlike the Greeks, whose land was soon after taken over by other peoples, and whose civilization ceased to develop along its original line, Chinese culture has lived on as an unbroken tradition to this day. Cultural influence and Buddhism. Naturally, China also suffered from invasions and conquerors. But the culture of the foreigners was always more primitive than the Chinese, and it almost always ended with them being absorbed by Chinese culture. Until modern times, Indian culture was the only equal civilization that the Chinese came into contact with. The two cultures met peacefully through trade and intellectual contact. For China, this meeting was of great significance, not least because it brought with it a new religion, Buddhism. Early beliefs. Before Buddhism, Chinese religion resembled that of the ancient Greeks, with many different gods representing various aspects of nature, and with dogmas that attempted to explain the mysteries of the universe in human terms. Educated people, even if they were aware of the possibility that there could be some higher, supernatural power, were not religious and in a traditional sense, and worshipped no deity. Instead, they lived their lives in accordance with a moral code that had developed from human principles. The philosophy that was most prominent and which dominated China for thousands of years was Confucianism. It is named after its founder, Master Kongzi, or Kongfutse, according to the Roman spelling Confucius. Confucianism was mainly concerned with human relations and taught a practical order for people to live in harmony with each other. As a counterweight to this worldly view, another way of thinking developed, Taoism. The word Tao means the way, and Taoism was a mystical search for the laws that govern our lives, also encompassing life forms other than human. These two major systems of thought were already established when Buddhism came to China. At its highest level, Buddhism was also an intellectual religion, but it brought with it its own gods, spirits, and beliefs, which were eagerly received by the Chinese and incorporated into their own tenets. Buddhism also influenced the original Taoism, which then acquired more elements of religious practices, such as priesthood and monasticism. Since the religions in China developed from many different sources, they were a mixture of different beliefs. They were completely different from a religion like Christianity, which, even though it has incorporated some elements from other religions and cults, has still maintained its basic beliefs in a very unadulterated form. The Christian God is absolute, while the Chinese deities compete and crowd one another both in heaven and on earth. The result is often a colorful mixture of Buddhist and Taoist elements. In this video, the 4 following chapters deal with China's oldest god tales, myths created by a simple, robust people to explain the things they did not understand in the surrounding world. Thereafter, in following videos, I will take a look at folk tales and religious legends from the later civilization. There are no clear differences between these, even though the religious legends stem from a more complex and technically more advanced society. All these stories are now old, and some are indeed very ancient, dating from the 8th to the 5th century BC. Many have been passed down to us through oral tradition, and there may be different versions of each story. This often occurs when stories are presented orally instead of in writing. Each time a person passes the story on, the details change, even though the main features remain the same. Almost all stories are well known to today's Chinese people, who have loved them and told them over and over again to their children. People have stopped believing in the gods as supernatural beings, but many of the religious practices survive as colorful folk customs, such as, for example, the Dragon Boat Festival, which, like Christmas in the Western world, constitutes a welcome break in the daily routine. The Chinese divide their history into dynasties, where each dynasty represents the time during which the emperors of a certain lineage rule. The last imperial dynasty before the Republican era was the Qing dynasty, and it lasted from the 17th century until 1911. The Tang dynasty, which is often mentioned in these stories, lasted from the 7th century to the 10th century, and it was one of the liveliest and most flourishing periods in Chinese history. Even though the Chinese language has changed radically through the centuries, the Chinese characters, that is to say, the Chinese written language, have remained the same since approximately the 3rd century BC, when the first Qin emperor, the first powerful Chinese despot, is said to have standardized the written language. We no longer know how ancient Chinese people pronounce the characters, but nowadays, according to the normal Chinese way of speaking, which is also called Mandarin, each character is pronounced as a single syllable, where 1 or 2 syllables constitute a word. Chinese surnames almost always consist of 1 syllable, such as, for example, Zhang or Li. Gods from the beginning of time. In the beginning of time, the world was a dark chaos, a black mass of nothing. Heaven and earth were not separated, nor were night and day. The sun, the moon, and all the stars were not yet created. It is almost impossible for the human brain to imagine a situation where nothing exists. And to make this unimaginable time and place more real, some imagined it as a large egg. In this dark egg-like mass, the universe's first living being was born. His name was Pangu. Pangu grew in an all-encompassing darkness, and he was immersed in sleep for several thousand years. When he finally woke up, he had grown into a giant, and when he noticed that he lived in chaos, he decided to create order. He took a heavy axe, but we have no idea where he got it from, and with a mighty blow, he split the egg in 2 parts. The lighter components in the egg streamed upward to form the sky. The heavier elements sank downward and formed the earth. When the elements were separated by the force of Pangu's blow, he became afraid they would flow back together. So with his hands, he pushed the sky further upward, while he stepped hard on the earth to keep it separate from the sky. He was so strong that he pushed the sky 1 zhang, about 3 meters, higher up for every day that passed. As the sky drew higher and higher upward, Pangu became longer and longer, until he finally stood like a pillar and held up the vault of heaven. For eons he stood in this way until heaven and earth, each in their own way, took solid form, and there was no longer any risk that they would close together again and return to the dark chaos from which they had arisen. When Pangu had completed his task, he felt that now he could lie down to rest a bit. But many thousands of years had passed since he first had started growing inside the primordial egg, and now he was so old, both in body and soul, that his sleep became deeper and deeper, and he slowly slipped into death. But Pangu did not return to the darkness from which he had come. When he died, his body was transformed and became the world we have today. His breath became wind and clouds. His voice became the thunder. His left eye was transformed into the sun, and the right became the moon. His body and limbs became mountain ranges, and his blood became running rivers. Every piece of his body became a part of nature. The hair on his body became trees and flowers. The insects that lived on his skin became mammals and fish, and the skeleton was transformed into various kinds of precious stones and minerals. Even his sweat was transformed into dew. Thus the giant Pangu, the first living creature in the universe, created the world we have today and gave all he had to the benefit of the earth and the humans who would soon come to inhabit it. As far as heaven and earth are concerned, they remained separated, even though some people later believed that the high mountains created from Pangu's body served as pillars to support the blue vault of heaven. Although the universe had now taken shape and was complete with sun, moon, mountains, rivers, plants, and animals, there were still no humans. The earth was inhabited in these ancient times by gods, giants, and other wondrous creatures. The most significant of the gods was the mother goddess Nüwa, who was the creator and the one who brought order to the world. The upper part of her body had a human shape, with a human face and human arms, but the lower part of the body was shaped like a dragon. She could also change shape and appeared in many different forms. Nüwa traveled around the world, but even if she thought it was flourishing and beautiful, it was also lonely and desolate, for there were no humans, and Nüwa longed for creatures who could love, feel, and think like her. One day she came to the great yellow river. She took clay from the riverbed and formed small dolls of clay. She made the head and arms like her own, but instead of a dragon tail, she gave the dolls legs so that they could walk upright. She took great care in the work on these small images and was pleased with the result. Then she breathed life into them and saw to her delight how they dashed about and danced around her, while they joyfully cried out and called her their mother. At first she made the dolls one by hand, but when she made a large number in this time-consuming, meticulous way, she decided to use her supernatural powers so that it would go faster. She rolled a stick in the clay in the river, and when she swung it up over dry land, small lumps of clay fell from it and were immediately transformed into men and women. Afterwards, people used to say that the humans she created with her own hands were the people in the world who were happy and gifted, while those created by swinging the stick were the poor and more disadvantaged. When Nüwa eventually had created enough men and women, she instituted marriage among them so that they could reproduce and carry on the human race further without additional help from her side. Nüwa had a husband who appeared in old paintings in a similar shape to her, with a human head and upper body, but with a lower body like a dragon. His name was Fushi, and he too was a great benefactor to humanity. The greatest gift of all that he gave to humans was fire. Humans had seen fire come down from the sky in the form of lightning, but it was Fushi who taught them how to take it into service for their own use, and who showed them how to produce it by drilling a piece of dried wood against another. With fire, humans could cook their food and no longer needed to eat it raw and hard to digest. They could also hunt more effectively, for all wild animals feared the flames, and only the human could control them. According to some accounts, Fushi was either the son or brother of the thunder god himself, and that was why he could give his great gift to humanity. Fushi also taught humans how to make ropes and nets to catch fish with, but he did not only occupy himself with practical things. He also saw to humans' spiritual needs by teaching them music, and he taught them the mysterious art of divination, of predicting the future. It was he who first drew up the 8 trigrams, which consist of 3 lines, either whole or broken, which in different combinations represent the 8 basic elements: heaven, earth, water, fire, mountain, thunder, wind, and flood. The trigrams are then combined in pairs into 64 different hexagrams, and these are interpreted with the help of a divination handbook known as Yijing, I Ching, or the Book of Changes. People in both the East and West still consult this ancient book. The art of prediction was extremely important in these primitive times. Humans were dependent on it to be able to predict the outcome of wars, to foresee peace treaties and state affairs, and, before modern medicine made its entry, to guess the progression of a disease. In ancient writings, the names Fuxi and Nüwa are often associated with the friends of humanity. Some meant that they were siblings, others that they were husband and wife. There are also stories that give them another role in the creation of the human race. According to these stories, the earth was for a long time flooded by a mighty water. The only humans who managed to escape from drowning were a young boy and girl named Fuxi and Nüwa, who managed to save themselves in a large gourd. When the water eventually receded, Fuxi and Nüwa married, and with their children, the human race began anew. Whatever lies behind the various myths about Fuxi and Nüwa, one thing remains clear. They were regarded as the original founders of humanity and were our first teachers. After Nüwa had created humans, and Fuxi had taught them the skills they needed to know to be able to lead a civilized life, humans could live in a certain comfort and security. But one day, quite unexpectedly, Gong, the water god, and Zhurong, the fire god, suddenly began to war against each other. No one knew why the conflict broke out, but it soon took on raging proportions and spread from the sky down into the human world. After many days of bitter struggle, the fire god Zhurong triumphed. The water god Zhurong felt immensely ashamed of himself. Yes, so much so that he did not dare to meet the other gods again, but decided to take his own life. The method he chose had disastrous consequences for humanity, where he decided to kill himself by driving his head against one of the mountains that served as pillars to hold the world up. In point of fact, he caused himself very little harm. He was, after all, a god, but he caused a great deal of destruction to the mountain he had chosen to hurl himself against. The mighty peak of jagged stone tumbled down all around him and crushed one corner of the world, at the same time as the piece of the sky that the mountain had supported fell away and left behind a large hole in the blue sky. Enormous cracks gaped in the shattered earth. From some of them, flaming tongues of fire welled up, while from others, water gushed from unknown depths, flooding large land areas and turning them into sea. Thousands of people drowned. Thousands more watched helplessly as the tongues of fire swallowed their houses and harvests. Nüwa, the creator and bringer of order, could not just passively watch this terrible destruction and see how her children were turned into refugees. As soon as she could, she began to repair the damages. From the riverbeds of the Yellow River and the Yangtze Kiang, she carefully selected small stones in the 5 primary colors. These she melted in a heavenly furnace and repaired the sky with them, so that it once again became a whole, rounded vault. To ensure that the heavens would never fall down again, she took one of the large immortal tortoises, cut off its 4 legs, and set them up as extra support pillars in the 4 cardinal directions. She burned reeds that grew by the river, and with the ash she filled in the large cracks that had opened in the earth, and she forced back the masses of water that flooded the land. According to some sources, she manufactured an instrument of reed pipes to help humans forget their terrible experience. 13 different long reed pipes were tied together in the shape of a bird's tail, and thus formed a sort of pan flute. When one blew into the pipes, they gave off a pure and very musical tone. But there was one thing that even Nüwa could not do anything about. When the mountain pillar fell, it landed across the country's northeastern corner. And ever since then, this part is lower than the rest of the country. That is why all rivers and waterways in China tend to flow toward the east and discharge their water into the Great Sea that was formed in the hollowed-out eastern part of the country. If one looks at a map of China, one sees that all major rivers even today flow eastward toward the sea. The Islands of Bliss. When the first humans discovered that all of China's rivers and waterways emptied into the Great Sea in the east, they began to worry that it would one day be overfilled and that the water would flood the land. If that happened, they did not know how long it would last, but it would mean a new catastrophe for humanity. But there was no reason to worry. Far to the east in the sea, no one knows exactly how far, there was a great abyss. This abyss was so deep that it could without exaggeration be considered bottomless, and so vast that it could never be filled. Into this abyss flowed all the water from the sea, and not even all of China's waterways, releasing their powerful spring floods into the sea, filled the abyss completely. The water surface inside the abyss formed another sea, where there once were 5 quite large islands, and in the middle of each was a mountain. These were the Paradise Islands, which were populated by gods and immortals who lived in palaces of gold with pillars of white jade. The birds that circled around them were either the whitest white, or they had the most brilliant, shimmering plumage imaginable. The trees, which bowed down, bore both real pearls and edible fruits in all exquisite flavors, which granted immortality to all who ate of them. The inhabitants of these islands lived a happy, carefree life. The only thing that now and then worried them was that, however wonderful the islands were, they had one drawback. The islands were namely floating, and not fixed to the seabed, but drove around in the great abyss, and stopped now here, now there, while they changed places with each other, and in general felt quite unstable. The Immortals, who began to tire of this wandering existence, went to speak with the supreme heaven god Tiandi, whose name means ruler of the heavens, and asked that the islands for their safety might be properly anchored. The god understood their problem, and even if not even he could anchor the islands in an abyss that had no bottom, he came up with a way to help them. 15 giant sea turtles were chosen to carry the 5 islands on their backs and swim around with them in the sea. The sea turtles were extremely slow and steady in their movements, and one could rely on them not to cause any trouble for the islanders. Everyone was very pleased with the new arrangement, and life continued its usual course. Then a terrible catastrophe occurred. A giant, who was not particularly intelligent, decided without any real reason to go out and fish. He sat down on a large rock furthest out on the coast and cast his long fishing line far out over the waves, far away beyond the horizon where the sea meets the sky. The line was heavy when he hauled it in, and when the end became visible above the horizon, he saw 2 large sea turtles lying there and sprawling up and down, and the islands they carried on their backs were completely and utterly underwater. Pleased with his catch, the giant hauled the sea turtles straight up out of the sea and took them home with him to have a feast. The inhabitants of the 2 drowned islands were naturally very shocked when their whole world literally turned upside down, and their beautiful homes were destroyed. Together they went to heaven to present their bitter complaint to the supreme god, Tiandi. Supreme God Tiandi listened sympathetically. "Your situation is naturally very difficult," he said at last. "For as long as there are giants of this size in the world, the same thing can very well happen again. There is only one way if one wants to ensure that you all shall be safe, and that is that the giants become smaller. As for the other 3 islands, I can promise you that they will remain unharmed." From that time, the giants became significantly smaller and no longer posed any threat to the islanders. Just as Tiandi had promised, the remaining islands remained safely carried on the sea turtles' backs, and they were completely stable and safe to live on. They are named Penglai, Pangu, and Yingzhou. And since those ancient times, one has heard talk of them as a place of refuge for immortals and other unusual men and women, who there can find peace away from the chaos of the human world. Kuafu chases the sun. One of the giants who lived at the beginning of time was a man named Kuafu. Kuafu was an enormously tall and impressive person, but like many other giants, he was not particularly intelligent. He loved to see the sun rise in the east every morning and sink behind the horizon in the west in the evenings, and he said to himself, "I loathe the darkness. Where does the sun go in the west? Where does it hide until the next morning? If I could hold the sun fast in my sky, I would never have to live in darkness." He pondered for a while. Then he said, "I know. I shall chase the sun and catch it so that I can enjoy its light all the time, both night and day." Kuafu began his sun hunt on the plains of northern China. Because he was a giant, he had very long legs, and in a single day, he ran in over 1,800 miles. Toward evening, he was right at the place where the sun rested during the night. In exuberant joy that he would succeed, he stretched out his hands to grab the glowing fireball. Then he suddenly felt a terrible thirst, a thirst such as he had never felt before, and which he could not ignore. It seemed to consume his whole body and burn him up inside. He ran to the nearest river and in a single gulp dried up the entire river. But it had no greater effect on his thirst than a drop of water would have had. He ran to another river, then to another, and yet another. But none of them were enough to quench his thirst. With his giant steps, he turned back over the stretch of land he had covered during the hunt and emptied all the wells, streams, and rivers he passed by. Yes, he dried up both the Yellow River and the Yangtze Kiang. Still, he was thirsty. His only hope was to reach the sea, where he would surely finally find enough water to be able to drink his fill. But before he reached the shore, he collapsed from exhaustion, and when the last golden rays of the setting sun reached him where he lay stretched out on the ground, he gave up a long sigh. With a final exertion of strength, he flung his walking stick toward the sun as a final proof of his anger, whereupon he closed his eyes and fell asleep. The next day, when the blinding rays of the morning sun again shone from the east and reached the sleeping giant's body, he was no longer a giant. Where he had lain, there was now a massive mountain range. West of the mountains was a forest grove that had the shape of a long staff, and despite the fact that the trees had not been there the day before, their leaves were green and their fruits shimmered pink and lovely among the branches. These trees had grown from the walking stick of peach wood that Kuafu had flung toward the sun, and they bore the juiciest fruits one can imagine. Peaches that would always refresh a person, quench the most violent thirst, and spur them to walk further. People say that the giant's body was transformed into the large mountain range in Shaanxi province, which is now called Mount Xiu. At the western end of the mountain range lies an area that is still today called the Peach Orchard. The giant who had no head. There was once a giant who had no name, but who on the other hand had great ambitions. He wanted nothing less than to defeat the supreme god Tiandi and steal his throne. With a round shield on his left arm and an axe in his right hand, he climbed straight up into heaven where he raised his battle cry and challenged the supreme god to a fight. "Who dares to challenge me?" roared Tiandi angrily, and he grabbed his sword and ran out to meet the giant. They fought for days, dealing blow after blow and dancing around each other without pausing for better or worse. During the battle, they moved constantly, changing places to get better footing and drawing away without noticing it down into the world of humans. They fought all the way along the large mountain ranges in western China until they came to a mountain called Chanjiang. There, Tiandi lifted his sword high into the air, and with a violent blow, he severed the giant's head from his body so that it fell down the mountain like a boulder. When the head rolled down the mountain, it let out a sound like thunder, and a rumble echoed and thundered through all the valleys and forests. Strangely enough, the giant's large body did not fall. For a minute, he stood there in astonishment over the blow. Then in panic, he took his axe in his left hand instead and bent down to search for his head on the ground. All the nearby mountain peaks shook when his giant hand swept over them, tore loose cliff blocks, and sent thundering landslides down into the valleys below him. Trees snapped, and a cloud of wood splinters, pebbles, and earth whirled high up into the air and darkened the sun. The high god Tiandi watched it all from a distance, afraid that the giant would find his head, put it back in place, and take up the fight again. Quickly, he grabbed his sword and chopped a cleft in the mountain wall near the place where the head had finally ended up lying. The large head rolled into the cleft, and with a dull sound, the mountain closed again. With a triumphant laugh, Tiandi returned to heaven and left the giant behind on the mountainside, where he stood and listened to the echo from the cliff blocks colliding with each other, turning his headless body first one way, then the other, in his attempts to comprehend what had happened. But the giant without a name was still not defeated. While he stood there, new eyes grew out on his chest, and his navel was transformed into a new mouth. While he performed a war dance that made the mountain shake once more, and defiantly swung his axe, he roared his battle cry toward the heavens. "Come out and meet your challenger, high heaven god." As far as we know, he is still standing there today, still waiting. The Yellow Emperor. The Yellow Emperor was a significant god in ancient times. He was a very powerful being and had many children, some of whom were gods and others humans. He interested himself greatly in humans, and because he protected them and helped them to live a peaceful, well-ordered life, he was often considered to be an earthly emperor, the first to rule over China. One of his greatest deeds was the defeat he inflicted upon a monster named Qiyu. Qiyu began his life as a rather insignificant god who had the task of being a messenger to the Yellow Emperor, one who cleared the way for him when he was going out to travel. Qiyu was, however, very ambitious, and he planned to overthrow the Yellow Emperor and conquer his throne. As followers, Qiyu gathered about 80 minor gods who were dissatisfied with the Yellow Emperor's way of ruling. These gods were hideous to behold. They had heads of iron and faces of copper, and 4 eyes, 6 hands and claws instead of feet. Their food consisted of stone and metal, and they were especially skilled in manufacturing iron weapons of all kinds, sharp lances, spears, axes, and strong bows. When Qiyu had trained and organized these demon gods in heaven, they made their way down to earth. There they sought out the barbarian tribe Miao in southern China and incited them to rebellion and dissatisfaction toward the Yellow Emperor. During all this time, the Yellow Emperor lived unconcerned in his palace without having any idea of the intrigues and conspiracies going on all around him. Therefore, it came as a shock when Qiyu suddenly went to the attack with his terrifying army of copper-faced demons. In the beginning, the Yellow Emperor tried to talk Qiyu to reason, but Qiyu was far too consumed by his ambition and refused to listen. The battle broke out in full earnest. Swords and armor clattered and rattled, and the peaceful countryside was filled with battle cries. Qiyu was determined to win at any cost, and when the battle was at its fiercest, he used his magical powers for help and enveloped the Yellow Emperor's army in a thick fog. The Yellow Emperor tried to gather his men and break out of the cloud that enveloped them, but it was futile. No matter how they tried, they just walked around in circles while the treacherous fog swirled around them. Just as they were about to give up, one of the Yellow Emperor's ministers, who fought together with him in the imperial war chariot, had an idea. If only we could see the stars through this cloud, we would easily know where we were. I just wonder, how would it be if we had something as a landmark, like for example, the North Star, something that could lead us all out of the fog? The minister immediately set to work with his magical powers, and within a few minutes, he had invented and manufactured the first compass. With this wonderful new instrument, the Yellow Emperor and his army easily found their way out of the fog, and the battle began anew, just as violent as before. Now the Yellow Emperor summoned another of his warriors, Yinglong. His name means the dragon Ying, a god who could summon rain whenever he wanted. "Give me a storm that sweeps these rebels out of heaven," he commanded. But once again, Qiyu outsmarted him. Before Yinglong had even managed to begin his magical arts, Qiyu summoned a torrential rain that struck down the Yellow Emperor's entire army. But still, the Yellow Emperor was not defeated. He sent for one of his daughters, a goddess who was always burning hot, and she came and dried up the heat from her glowing body, stopped the rain, and left only small steaming puddles of water that quickly evaporated. The army was saved, but the Yellow Emperor's daughter had completely exhausted her strength and could no longer remain in heaven. On Earth, no one wanted her either, for wherever she went, she dried up the rivers, the wells, and the fields, and humans hunted her from village to village. She became a feared and hated and outcast creature. Yinglong the Rainmaker could not remain in heaven either, for he had been defeated by a superior power and had lost his prestige. He too remained on Earth, where he became king in southern China. Even today, southern China is often hit by his reign. The Yellow Emperor now seemed to be on his way to winning the war, but his army was exhausted and the fighting spirit very low. Qiyu still posed a threat, and the Yellow Emperor knew he had to come up with something to cheer up his soldiers. After thinking carefully about the matter, he realized that he needed a war drum that sounded higher and stronger than any they had heard before. a drum that could truly instill courage in his army and terror in his enemies. In the Eastern Sea lived a monster named Kui, a strange creature that was like a one-footed ox. It spent its life floating around in the sea in the company of storms, and when it opened its large mouth, it spat out lightning and rumbled like thunder itself. "From this Kui I shall make my drum," said the Yellow Emperor, and he sent out his strongest warriors to catch and kill the monster. A drum was manufactured from its skin, but despite the men hammering on it with their fists, the sound was not loud enough to please the Yellow Emperor. Then he came to think of the Thunder God. Without hesitating so much as a minute, he ordered that the Thunder God should be killed, removed his thigh bones, and gave them to the first drummer. Finally, the large drum rumbled. The Yellow Emperor's forces marched out to battle, and the copper-faced demons were driven to flight. The war was over in heaven, but the Miao tribes on earth were still in revolt. But it did not take long before the Yellow Emperor had manned them, and simultaneously captured Chiyo and bound him with handcuffs and chains. Since Chiyo still refused to surrender, and the Yellow Emperor saw no other choice than to execute him, Chiyo put up such violent resistance that the shackles around his wrists became blood-stained from his blood. And when Chiyo had been killed, the Yellow Emperor threw the handcuffs into the wilderness. There they were transformed into maples. And when the leaves turn bright red every year, humans say that the color comes from Chiyo's blood and wrath. The bird and the sea. The sun god had a daughter whom he loved dearly, more than all his other children. One day, the little girl took a boat out onto the Eastern Sea just for fun. Unfortunately, a storm blew up when she was completely out of sight from land, and waves as high as mountains crashed over the boat and drowned her. The sun god mourned his favorite daughter, but not even in his mighty rays could call her back to life, and he withdrew with his sorrow and went to mourn her in solitude. The deceased girl was embittered over her untimely death, and her soul was transformed into a small bird named Jingwei. Jingwei had a mottled head, a white beak, and red legs, and she hated the sea that had robbed her of her life and taken her away from her father. Every day, she took a small stone or twig in her beak, spread her wings, and flew away from land out over the Eastern Sea. She hovered over the waves and dropped her burden in the water in the hope that the sea would one day be filled with stones and twigs. For a long time, the sea took no notice of the little bird. Then one day it laughed loudly at her and mocked. Little bird, stop your efforts. Your work will never be finished, even if you keep at it for millions of years. How can you believe that you could ever fill the sea with stones and twigs?" The bird fluttered its wings and cried, "And if I drop stones and twigs for millions of years, millions of times, for millions of years, until the end of time, I will never stop. And one day, I will have filled you up completely." "Why do you hate me so?" the sea asked. "Because you took my young life and the lives of countless innumerable others who have died because of your cruelty." "Stupid bird," the sea mocked again. "You will never succeed." I shall. The bird's sorrowful cry was heard over the sea. "One day I will succeed." The little bird flew back to land only to return again, time after time, to drop small stones and twigs into the waves. And so she continues even today. The cuckoo. In the ancient kingdom of Shu, which is now called the province of Sichuan, there was once a king named Wang. From the beginning, Wang was a god who lived in heaven. He came down to visit the earth, and there he met a woman who was also immortal, and who had left her home in a deep spring and settled in Shu. The two immortals married and then ruled the kingdom together. King Wang was a benevolent ruler and was always interested in the people's best interests. He taught them how to best cultivate the land and how to pay attention to the seasons. The kingdom flourished, but there was still one problem that Wang could not solve. Through the kingdom flowed the great Yangtze River, and every year it flooded and destroyed large areas with crops. Even though Wang was prepared to do everything he could for his people, he was completely powerless when it came to curbing the floods. Then one day, a dead man was found floating in the Yangtze. It was immediately understood that it was no ordinary corpse, for instead of drifting downstream with the current, it floated upstream. And not only that, as soon as the people had pulled the body out of the river, it became alive again. When the stranger had recovered enough to be able to speak properly, he said that he came from Chu, several hundred mil further down the river, and that he had slipped and fallen into the river. Wang soon heard talk of the stranger's arrival, and he was immediately curious to meet him. When they met, he was deeply impressed by the stranger's wisdom and knowledge, especially since he seemed to know a lot about rivers and how to control them. Wang was so eager to find a solution to the flooding problems that he took the stranger with him to the court and made him a powerful minister. The new minister had not been at the court long before the Yangtze River flooded again. He immediately understood what caused the problem. In just the part of the country where the river ran through several gorges that were too narrow to accommodate the masses of water that rushed down from the mountains when the snow melted in the spring, the water rose rapidly over the edges of the gorges and flowed over the plateau on both sides of them. The minister showed the people how they should dig tunnels through the mountains to divert the water from the riverbed, and in this way, the land of Shu was saved. Wang decided to hand over the throne to this man who could master the water, and he himself left the court and settled in the mountains in the west. But he had not been there more than a short time before he heard rumors that were very unfavorable to him. According to these rumors, the man from Shu, while Wang was busy organizing the control of the river, had seduced his wife. When the man came to him and they were together, Wang had, ashamed of what he had done, surrendered the throne to him. Wang never recovered from the shock he felt when he heard these lies, and he regretted bitterly that he had been so generous. Soon he died of grief and disappointment. His soul was transformed into the bird we today call the cuckoo. In Chinese, his sorrowful cry sounds like, "Better to return," and ever since then, the bird has called out Wang's regret that he left his people. Some people have another explanation for the cuckoo's origin and its call. According to them, Wang died as a natural and happy god among his people. But his love for them was so great that his soul returns every year in the form of a cuckoo at the beginning of the sowing season. His unusual call reminds the people that they should hurry with the sowing and pay attention to the seasons when they cultivate the land. The ancient heroes. In the sea beyond the Eastern Ocean, in the easternmost part of the world, there once grew a tree called Fusang. This tree was several hundred meters high and about 350 meters in circumference. In the lush branches sat suns and chirped like birds. In these ancient times, there was not just one shining, hot golden sun, but 10 of them. At night, they tumbled around in the sea and bathed to renew their luster, and then sat on the branches of the great Fusang tree. They took turns circling around the earth and shining down on humanity, so people on earth believed there was only a single sun that gave them light and warmth. They knew nothing of the other 9 in the earth's eastern corner, who made the sea they bathed in scalding hot. These 10 sons were the children of the god of the east, Dijun, and his wife Shiho, the sun goddess. One day, the 10 brothers, who were not particularly obedient to their parents, rose up into the sky simultaneously instead of doing as they usually did. With 10 suns simultaneously in the sky, it became so bright and hot that everything was burned up. It may be that the suns were so happy over their blinding light that they expected the people on earth would also be happy, but they were wrong. Humans hated them. The earth parched, harvests, flowers, and trees withered. Yes, even mountains and metals seemed to melt. Blood throbbed in people's veins, and they could hardly breathe by day or night. They had almost nothing to eat, and since all the rivers had dried up, there was a great shortage of water. And things did not get better when terrifying monsters emerged from the forests, where the trees had been transformed into dry sticks, and up from the depths of the shrinking lakes and rivers. Even if the sun's father, Dijun, lived up in heaven, He was not deaf to the people's pleas and the desperate prayers from their leader, Emperor Yao. Since he could not talk his unruly children into sense, he decided to take more drastic measures. He summoned an immortal archer named Yi. Dijun gave Yi a red bow and a quiver full of white arrows and sent him down to earth. "Do what you must do," he said, "but do not harm my sons more than necessary." Yi did as he had been told. He took his wife Chang'o with him and set off straight to the emperor's palace, where he saw with his own eyes the frightful devastation the sons had caused and the suffering among the humans. And the crowds that came every day to ask the emperor for help grew more and more. First, Yi climbed up onto a height and threatened the suns that danced around in the sky. He hoped that the mere sight of the magical bow and arrow would make them see reason. But the suns had become power-hungry and were not in the mood to let themselves be intimidated so easily. They did not care in the slightest about him. Then Yi notched an arrow, aimed carefully at one of the suns, and shot the arrow. An instant later, a heavy fireball fell down to the ground. The air immediately became a little cooler, and thankful people rushed over to look at their fallen enemy. But all they saw was a giant three-legged crow lying ruffled on the ground. He notched arrow after arrow, shot, and again a fireball fell from the sky. Another three-legged crow lay dead at his feet. But the suns still refused to obey, and as Yi's arrows hit their targets one after another, the scorched earth began to breathe again. Fortunately for the earth, the emperor realized that at least one sun must remain to provide the earth with warmth and light. He snuck up behind Yi and counted the arrows remaining in the quiver, and bent down and counted the dead crows. There were 4 arrows in the quiver, and on the ground lay 6 crows. Quickly, the emperor snatched an arrow from the quiver to ensure that at least one sun would survive. Yi was far too occupied to notice anything, and continued to fire his arrows until none were left. One sun, which now looked pale after the overwhelming light from the 10, still hung sorrowfully in the sky vault, and would never again depart from its solitary path. The suns were gone, but before the earth could return to normal, one had to deal with the monsters. With a new load of arrows, Yi shot mercilessly down at them. Out on the plains, they found one that the humans called the Great Wind. The Great Wind was an immense bird that resembled a huge peacock with a long spread tail and a grim eagle's beak. Just as an eagle used to strike down and snatch up both livestock and humans. It was so wide between the wings that every time it flew, a whirlwind was created behind it. Yi knew that the Great Wind's wings were so strong, and its flight so fast that it could easily fly away before he had time to fire more than a single arrow. Under cover of some rock ledge far away, it would then wait until the wound was healed, and then come back and cause further damage out on the plains. To prevent this, Yi tied a strong black silk cord to the shaft of his arrow. He aimed carefully and released the arrow so that it hit the big bird right in the chest. Before the bird could grasp what had happened, Yi began to pull hard on his end of the rope and drag the monster down to the ground so that he could kill it with his knife. Afterwards, he made his way to Lake Dongting, which lies in the middle part of the Yangtze River. In this lake, a large water snake had appeared when the water began to disappear, and it overturned fishing boats and swallowed the fishermen before they had time to reach the shore. Yi took a small boat and rowed back and forth across the lake, hoping to attract the monster's attention. He did not have to wait long. First, the monster's ugly head popped up, and behind the head, the coiled snake body was visible as it rushed toward its prey. Yi fired arrow after arrow against its scaly skin, but the snake was strong, and in the end, he had to go into close combat with it from his small, rickety boat. Finally, he managed to pierce the snake's heart with his sword. With one last blow of its tail, the snake disappeared forever into the depths. A multitude of small boats set out from the shore, and the fishermen then escorted Yi home. They pleaded with him to stay with them, but he refused. As long as there are still monsters roaming the earth, no one is safe. I cannot rest until they are once and for all eradicated, he said. Yi's last fight concerned an enormous man-eating boar that roamed in a mulberry forest. It was as large as an ox, and every night it trampled the crops, carried off livestock, and occasionally attacked villagers who had been careless enough to go out after dark. Not even this horrific monster was a match for Yi and his magical bow. He shot it in the legs, and then he dragged it, while it was still alive, back to the villages it had once terrorized. Thereupon a great feast was arranged where the large ceremonial pig was slaughtered, roasted, and eaten. Even the emperor came to celebrate the last animal's death and the beginning of a new life in peace and security. Yi received the best pieces of meat to take back to heaven as appreciation to Dijun, the god who had sent down the great archer to save the earth. Chang'o and the elixir of life. When Yi returned to heaven together with his wife Chang'o, he was fully prepared to be thanked and praised for his efforts in saving the earth. But it was not to be. When Yi stood face to face with Dijun, the god frowned angrily. "It is true that you have served humanity well, but do not count on me thanking you for it. You have killed my sons. I cannot think of them without mourning, and as soon as I see you, I am reminded even more of what I have lost. I simply cannot bear to have you in my vicinity. You and your wife must go and live among the humans you have served so well, and never again return to heaven." In vain, he tried to point out that it was not he who was responsible for the Sun Children's disobedient behavior, that he had only carried out the god's own orders. Dijun was immovable. For Yi, there was nothing left but to take Chang'o with him down to earth. And he became even more distressed when he noticed how hard Chang'o took the news that they were to be banished. She became even more disappointed and hurt than Yi himself. "What have I done to deserve this?" she complained. "I, who am a born goddess and raised in heavenly glory, can I be held responsible for my husband's actions?" And she cursed the fate that had brought her together with a man like Yi. But regardless, they had to obey Dijun's orders, and reluctantly the two immortals gathered all their belongings and moved down to earth. Yi found a place in the mountains where they settled, and he used his skill with the bow to provide for them through hunting. It was a hard life for Yi. All day he roamed the forests among the mountains to search for prey, and in the evening he returned exhausted to his dissatisfied wife. Chang'o refused to adapt to their new life, and never stopped reproaching him. "If you hadn't shot down the suns, we would still be gods and live in heaven," she used to say. "Now we are banished to a life on earth among humans, and just like humans, we are going to die. Just think about what that means, Yi. We, who have been immortal, must go down into the gloomy underworld and socialize with the spirits of the dead." Yi could do nothing but sadly agree with her and wonder what he could do about the matter, if there was anything at all to be done. One day, Chang'o herself came with a suggestion. "I've heard that there is something called the elixir of life," she said, "a remedy that is so strong that it grants immortality to whoever eats it. It is said that in the West, on Mount Kunlun, there lives a goddess named the Queen Mother of the West, and it is she who collects and keeps this elixir." Even Yi had heard talk of this goddess, and since he had no more desire than Chang'o to live and die as a human, he went along with seeking her help. The Queen Mother of the West might sound like a kind old lady with white hair, but in reality, she was a monster goddess. She had a human face, but teeth like a tiger, and her long, uncombed hair hung heavy over her ugly body, which ended in a leopard's tail. On her head, she wore a jade crown that looked like growing grass. As servants, she had 3 blue-throated birds that were always out hunting for food that might suit her. She never left her cave, but despite that, she had the power to send plagues over humans as punishment for their misdeeds. Mount Kunlun lay west of China, beyond the mountain ranges in Tibet. Even other gods besides the Queen Mother lived there, and the mountain formed a fantastic fortress against intruders. First, it was surrounded by a moat full of water where nothing could float. Even the lightest feather sank immediately to the bottom. Inside the moat was a circle of fire that emitted a consuming heat day and night. No mortal creature had ever made it through these 2 barriers, but Yi still had some of his divine abilities left, and he managed to swim over the water, make his way through the fire, and finally reached the cave where the Queen Mother lived. To his relief, the goddess was very understanding, and when she had heard his story, she gave him a small box. "This is the elixir of life," she said. "Keep it well, for it is truly very valuable. It is manufactured from an enchanted peach tree, whose fruits grant eternal life. This tree blooms only once every 3,000 years, and bears fruit only every 6,000th, including what I have managed to collect. It is found in this little box. It is enough to give both you and your wife eternal life, but you will always live in the world of humans. To win true immortality and divinity, you would need twice as much of the medicine. Here, take it, and be careful with it, for it is invaluable." Yi returned home the same way he had come and gave the elixir to his wife, while repeating everything the Queen Mother had said. "One of the coming days," he said, "I shall prepare a feast, and then we shall take the medicine. Then we will forever avoid having to die." Yi felt much happier than he had done in several months, and the next morning, he set off to hunt and try to find enough food to be able to cook a real feast. But his wife back home was not as pleased. She was still deeply embittered over the fact that she, who had once been a goddess, had been sent down to earth to live as an ordinary mortal. For her, it was not enough to merely avoid death. She wanted to be a goddess again and live among the gods in heaven as an equal. In confidence, he had told Shango everything, so she knew that the medicine was enough for one person to achieve full divinity. She decided to take it all for herself, took out the box from its hiding place, and swallowed the entire dose at once. The powerful drug took effect immediately. Shango felt her body being lifted up, and she floated slowly out through the window, and then upward, up through the air. "Actually, I probably shouldn't fly straight back up to heaven," she said to herself, while the ground below her became smaller and smaller. "All the gods know who I am, and they will surely reproach me for taking all the elixir myself and not leaving anything for my husband, even if it was all his fault from the beginning." She looked around. It was night, and the full moon shone, surrounded by sparkling stars. "I have heard that the moon is said to be completely uninhabited," she said. "It will be a good place to live." Slowly she floated higher and higher until she finally reached the cold, silver-colored moon. Exactly as she had expected, it was desolate, with the exception of a cassia tree and a hare. Their silhouettes are still seen on the moon's surface when it is full. There she settled and lived in solitude. We do not know if Shango became happy or not with her immortality. It was likely quite lonely for her up there on the moon. According to one version of the saga, the Queen Mother of the West was so angry at her for being so greedy and selfish that she transformed her into a toad and kept her prisoner there on the moon. But it feels more pleasant to imagine her living there in lonely majesty and forever looking down over the earth she chose to abandon. When Yi came home and discovered that both his wife and the elixir were gone, he soon realized what had happened. Without hope of any eternal life, he became a bitter and disappointed man. Among the servants in Yi's house, there was one named Feng Meng. Feng Meng was a capable servant, and Yi chose him to be taught especially. He became Yi's hunting companion, and Yi taught him everything about hunting with bow and arrow. Feng Meng became a very skilled archer, but no matter how he strained himself, he never managed to surpass his master. Once, when they were out hunting together, they both shot at a flock of flying geese. Each released 3 arrows, and even if all hit, Yi's arrows went straight through the bird's eyes, while Feng Meng's only hit some part of the body. When the birds, frightened, flew off in all directions, Yi shot 3 more arrows at random, and again 3 birds fell to the ground with pierced eyes. Then Feng Meng understood that he would never be as skilled as his master, and he turned away jealous and brooded over his own failure. Feng Meng became increasingly envious for every day that passed, and soon his reverence for his master had turned into hatred. Simultaneously, it became increasingly difficult to please Yi, for he became more and more demanding, irritable, and ungrateful. It was not difficult for Feng Meng to play on the dissatisfaction that already existed among his fellow servants, and then organize a conspiracy to to kill Yi. One beautiful morning when Yi was out hunting, his servants lay in ambush. They waited for him by a tree on a narrow path where they knew he would pass. And when he came by, they hurled a hard, sharp wooden stake at his head. Yi, the great archer, died instantly. Despite Yi's soul ending up among the spirits of the dead in the underworld, he was not forgotten. He was honored both for his previous deeds and by being appointed as one of the leaders in the spirit world, where he was given the task of looking after evil spirits so that they would do as little harm as possible to the humanity he had done so much to save. Yu masters the river. Yao was the first human emperor to rule in China, and he was the wisest, most merciful ruler anyone has ever seen. He himself lived a remarkably simple life, without allowing himself any form of luxury. He lived only for his people. Still, he was the most disaster-stricken emperor one can imagine. During his reign, the great drought occurred when 10 suns simultaneously shone in the sky. And just as the land was beginning to recover, a catastrophic flood occurred that almost destroyed everything once more. It was Tiandi, the supreme heaven god, who caused the flood. When he looked down at humans and their wickedness, he sent out the water god to drown their fields and homes, without caring that many innocent people were also affected. Several of the gods took pity on the humans, and among them was a white divine horse named Gun. Gun seemed more upset than the other gods, and after he had unsuccessfully pleaded with Tiandi to spare the humans, he walked around in heaven and was very distressed for their sake. One day he met 2 friends, an owl and a tortoise. When they saw how sad and despondent he was, they asked what had happened. "The earth down there lies flooded," answered Gun, "and there is nothing I can do to save it." "Stopping a flood on earth is not so difficult," answered the owl. "What one needs is a precious substance called sharang. It doesn't look like much more to the world than an ordinary clay clod, but in reality, it is a very magical substance. If you can get hold of it, even if ever so little, you can overcome any flood whatsoever. The sharang lump swells up to an incredible size as soon as it comes into contact with water, and it becomes completely impenetrable. But naturally, this substance is well hidden and also guarded." Gun conducted careful investigations, and it was not long before he managed to find out where the magical clay was kept. He managed to steal a little clay, which he carefully took with him down to earth, and soon he had built a large, impenetrable dam against the water masses. The joy and gratitude the humans showed was reward enough, but the supreme god Tiandi was not as pleased. In fact, he became furious and sent the fire god to earth to kill Gun and remove the magical clay. And once again, the kingdom lay underwater. Because Gun had not yet finished his work, his spirit did not die. Instead, a son began to develop within him who would complete the father's work. For 3 years, the humans watched over Gun's body until the son, who was named Yu, was ready to be born. Again, the supreme god Tiandi became furious, and he sent out a god to rid himself of this new threat to his plans. With his sword, the god dealt a blow to Gun's body, but instead of killing the child, he released it, and in the form of a great dragon, Yu made his entrance into the world. The dragon's dramatic birth and the determination that had created him made Tiandi's heart soften, and he agreed to let him stop the flooding. Yu had no easy task ahead of him, for the water god, Gonggong, who had been given free rein in the land, did not want to let himself be defeated without a fight. But Yu took up the battle and succeeded in defeating him. Then he gave all the humans a bit of the magical clay so they could build a dam against the water masses. But Yu knew that this was only a temporary solution to the problem. So he set the people to work on creating a path for the water, so it could be led out into the sea without doing any damage. Therefore, he transformed himself into a dragon again and plowed a deep channel with his tail, and then showed the humans how they should dig one more deep canal. Flood water that flowed through these canals and emptied into the sea gradually became China's great rivers. Yu managed to become 30 years old before he had time to take a break from his work and start thinking about marriage. Since he did not know how he would find a suitable wife, he waited for a sign from the gods, and soon it came in the form of a white fox with 9 tails. The fox led him to a girl who lived on the nearby mountain Shun. A marriage contract was drawn up, and Yu and his new wife began a happy life together. But Yu's wife had never been allowed to know that her husband was a god, and a few months later, when she was expecting their first child, this ignorance became the cause of a tragic accident. Yu was still fully occupied with getting the water under control, and one day, he transformed himself into a bear to be able to dig a water tunnel through a hill. His wife caught sight of him when he was a bear and ran terrified from there. When he followed her to explain, she ran only faster and faster until she finally collapsed and was transformed into a stone. The despairing Yu rushed to the stone, pounded on it and cried, "Give me my son!" The stone burst, and so Yu's son Qi was born. With his son's help, Yu continued his work of damming the water and exterminating the monsters that had appeared when the land was flooded. When he became old, he was proclaimed emperor after Yao and ruled his country with a wise and clever hand until his death. The abandoned child on the ice. During Yao's reign, China's land gradually recovered from the periods of drought and flooding, and people's lives began to return to normal. It was at this time that Huji was born. He was one of those who shaped Chinese philosophy of life. Huji's mother was named Jiangyuan, but no one knew who his father was. One day when Jiangyuan was on her way home along the path beside the river, she saw a row of enormous footprints, and she became both afraid and curious. She stepped, with her own small feet, into the first footprint and continued along the path while hopping from one footprint to another. She little suspected that by walking in these footprints she had become pregnant. But eventually, Huji was born. Because Huji had no father, the mother's relatives were afraid of scandal, and as soon as the child was born, they snatched him from Jiangyuan's arms and threw him out on a narrow cattle path where cows and sheep were usually driven. They expected he would soon be trampled to death by the animals. But instead, the cows and sheep went very carefully around him, and they also let him suckle their milk so that he grew and became strong. When the family noticed this, they took him from there again and put him out in a deep forest. But again, their plans were thwarted. Some woodcutters who were out to cut wood found the child and took him back to his home because they thought he had ended up there by an accident. In its despair, the family finally placed him on the cold ice of a frozen flood, but the birds lowered themselves over him and spread out their wings to keep him warm. Now the family understood that this was no ordinary child, and they rescued him and returned him to his mother. Huji was an unusual child. Already, as a little boy, he learned to pick and distinguish wild seeds and edible beans of all kinds. He brought them from the wilderness and cultivated them and improved them so that they became large, juicy, and filling for humans. He also began to manufacture simple agricultural tools, such as hoes. Eventually, the emperor himself got to hear talk of Huji's work, and he appointed him as Minister of Agriculture so that he could share his knowledge of grain and farming with all of China's people. Huji continued even after his death to improve the crops. The part of the land where he was buried became unusually fertile, and the yields of the grain types he had cultivated became larger there than anywhere else in China. The wise Emperor Shun. While Huji grew up and taught the people to better cultivate the land, another boy was born. His name was Shun. Shortly after he was born, his mother died, and his father, who was blind, remarried. From this marriage, a boy named Xiang and a girl named Shi were born. It was not a happy home that Shun grew up in. The blind father was not only blind in his eyes, but also in his heart and head, for he adored his second wife and her children, but was completely indifferent to his eldest son. Shun's stepmother, who was a wicked and greedy woman, hated Shun and did everything to make life miserable for him. Her son Shang, whose face was disfigured by a giant nose, did the same. The only one who cared for him at all was his half-sister Shi. Life became more and more unbearable for Shun at his father's house, and finally, he ran away from home. Even if Shun's relatives did not set any value on him, he had a remarkable influence on all other people he met. Wherever he went, he was well received by the people, and in his presence, they forgot their disputes and began to cooperate more peacefully with each other. Emperor Yao soon heard talk of this unusual man and had him summoned to the court. Just as everyone else, he was very impressed by Shun. He was actually so pleased with him that he decided to one day leave the throne to him. To facilitate the whole thing, he gave Shun his 2 daughters as wives. When Shun's family heard talk of his success, they became immensely envious and hated him more than ever. Most envious of all was his brother Xiang, for he was himself in love with his 2 beautiful sisters-in-law. Together with the old blind father, they decided to kill Shun. One day, Xiang came to Shun and asked him to help repair the family's barn. Shun naturally said yes without suspecting anything. But Shun's wives, on the other hand, were not as trusting, and because they were afraid that something would happen to him, they pleaded with him not to go. When they failed to convince him, they gave him a multicolored cloak with a large bird image on it. "Wear this the whole time while you are at your father's," they said. "Then nothing will happen to you, whatever they have in mind." Shun climbed up a high ladder to inspect the barn roof, and just as he reached the roof ridge and was about to call down to them that he could not find anything wrong, Xiang pulled the ladder away so that he could not get down. Shun saw to his horror that Xiang and his father had set fire to the barn, and that the flames were coming closer and closer, while the dry timber crackled and burned. "Help me, someone!" cried Shun. But the small figures down there stood only passively and watched. Then suddenly, the multicolored cloak with the bird painting came to life, and a pair of starling-like, feathered wings spread out and lifted him toward the sky, and thus Shun was brought to safety. A few weeks later, Shun's evil stepbrother made a new attempt. He came to the palace and showered Shun with beautiful words and excuses, and this time asked for help to clean the bottom of the well. Again, Shun's wives tried to persuade him to stay home, and again they gave him a garment when he refused to listen to them. This time, it was a cloak with a painted dragon. "Wear this under your regular clothes, and only reveal the image if you are in extreme danger." Shun arrived at his father's house, and although the family scrutinized him very closely, they saw nothing unusual about his clothes. "Now we shall succeed," they whispered. The well was deep, and Xiang lowered Shun, who was tied to a long rope. When he was about halfway down, he suddenly felt a jerk in the rope, and Shun discovered that he was falling faster and faster downward, while large stones tumbled past him. His wicked brother had cut the rope, and to be absolutely sure that Shun would not be able to get away, he threw large stones down after him. Shun managed to avoid the stones, and just before he reached the water surface, he was able to tear off his outer cloak so that the cape with the dragon pattern became visible. Instantly, Shun himself was transformed into a dragon, glided down into the water, and swam away via the underground springs that supplied the well with water, until he came up on land at another place and was safe. Xiang was still determined to kill Shun, and after some deliberation, he decided on a new attempt. He invited Shun to a family feast because his plan was that Shun would drink himself properly drunk on a specially prepared wine. Then, while he slept deeply, Xiang would kill him. As luck would have it, Shun's sister Shi heard about her brother's plans, and now she turned of her own accord to his wives for help. "Take this powder," they said, "and dissolve it in the bath water before you go to the feast, and wash yourself carefully in it." So the feast began. The family pretended to treat him with great respect, and they served him one dish after another and glass after glass of wine. But no matter how much wine he drank, he was not in the least bit intoxicated. Finally, he rose from the table and left, leaving all the others completely dead drunk. Emperor Yao was very pleased with his son-in-law's character and ways, and he decided to hand over the throne to him at once so that he himself could enjoy a more worry-free old age. There was only one test left that he had to go through to show that he was worthy. And it was a test of bravery. Yao sent Shun into a deep mountain forest. In this dark, sinister forest, constant thunderstorms raged. Lightning flashed ominously between the thick trees, and the downpours caused unpredictable flooding and landslides. Shadow-like monsters lurked among the dark trunks, ready to attack any living creature that ventured into their domains. Shun did not let himself be frightened, but walked calmly through the forest, while avoiding the tangled undergrowth as if it were only grass, and without caring in the least about the threatening beasts. Now Shun had cleared the final test, and it was not long before he was proclaimed emperor. The new emperor did not forget his family, even though they had treated him so poorly. He gave his father an annual allowance, and when he noticed that the father regretted his previous outrages, he forgave him everything. He also forgave his long-suffering brother, but sent him away to rule a colony far to the south in the kingdom, where he would not be tempted by envious thoughts. Shun reigned for many long years, and as an old man went on a journey through the southern part of his kingdom. When his wives received the news of his death, they set off weeping to arrange his funeral. When they came to southern China, they passed through a dense bamboo grove, and their tears left dark spots on the growing bamboo stalks. Even today, one can see a kind of spotted bamboo growing in southern China, which shows traces of their tears. The two wives never reached their husband's funeral. When they came to the river Xiang, they tried to cross it in a small boat, but the wind whipped up a storm, and they both drowned. The gods took pity on them and transformed their souls into goddesses who watch over the river Xiang. One day, a few months after Shun's early funeral had taken place, a dark-skinned man was seen sacrificing at his grave. It was the brother Xiang, who had become dark from the tropical sun and was almost unrecognizable, if not for the large nose. While people stood there and watched him, he was transformed to their amazement into an elephant and then ambled away to plow the fields near the grave. The gods had decided that Xiang must atone for the evil he had shown Shun while he lived, and because of the long nose, they had chosen the elephant as the most suitable animal. And that's where I think I'll wrap up the episode for tonight. Next up is ancient Roman mythology, and after that, all we have left is Norse mythology, and then we have finished the first round of episodes. Then I'll probably circle back around to Egyptian mythology again. Hope to see you all there in the next one.